Jackson one last time, and today we're going to be talking about the effects of Jackson's presidency. Here are your goals, which you know what to do with. All right, so the effects of Jackson's presidency are basically two. One is the triumph of popular democracy, and the second is two-party politics. So by popular democracy, I mean that elections had become part of pop culture. And this meant that to win the White House, or any other elected position, candidates now had to win the vote of the common man. And then two-party politics means that basically Jackson's controversial presidency split the Republican Party in half. And now instead of a single Republican Party, you have the Democratic Party and the Whig Party. So let's talk a little bit more about popular politics. So before Jackson, politics had been an affair of the rich and powerful. And this was basically because before you had to own a certain amount of property in order to vote. That meant that poor people couldn't vote. After Jackson, politics became a popular issue that every white male got to participate in. And this was because after Jackson, you no longer needed to own property in order to vote. As long as you were white and male, you could be a homeless person, and you were still allowed to show up on election day and cast a vote. And what this meant is that politicians had to be able to appeal to poor people. And what this meant was that politicians usually had to appear poorer than they actually were. So even if you came from a wealthy family and went to Harvard, you probably wouldn't talk about this when you were campaigning. Instead, you would talk about how you go out and farm and how you built your house with your bare hands and how you like to hang out and ride horses and stuff. Stuff that poor average Americans do. And so what this meant is that lots of politicians, even ones that weren't actually poor, would pretend to do this. And they could appeal to voters by talking about their life rather than talking about actual issues, with which most poor Americans didn't understand anyway. Was the two-party system. And so basically what happens here is that Jackson's presidency splits the nation into two new parties. One party, the one represented by Jackson, was the Democrats. And the Democrats were against big government. They believed that government should do less and basically leave the American people alone to do their thing. They also argued that America should continue to expand westward until they reached the Pacific Ocean, making us a nation from sea to shining sea. And they believed that this would help the average American because then average Americans could move west and get cheap land and start up a farm of their own. And this is kind of an extension of Thomas Jefferson's ideal of a nation of farmers. And the Democrats, with their belief in small government and westward expansion, tended to attract the votes of poorer Americans. The Whigs, on the other hand, supported bigger government. They believed that the government could make America better by taxing people and investing in stuff like public schools. They also supported the American system, and so this was the trifecta of tariffs, railroads, and the Bank of the United States. And they believed that this would make America stronger by helping to build up American industry. And these guys tended to attract votes from richer Americans. And now if we look at the election of 1840, we can actually see both of the changes caused by Jackson coming into effect. So the election is an election between a Democrat and a Whig. On the Democratic side, we have Martin Van Buren, who took over the presidency after Jackson. And on the Whig side, we see William Henry Harrison, who was another famous general from the War of 1812. And so basically, this shows how America has turned into a two-party system because these guys basically run according to what their party stands for. And everybody already knows more or less what these guys believe in because of the labels they use. People know that Martin Van Buren's for small government and that William Henry Harrison is for big government. But really the election is not so much about the issues. It's more about popular appeal. It's more about who can appeal to the poor masses of Americans. And the Whigs this time do a really good job of this. They label William Henry Harrison as a guy who was born in a log cabin and who drank hard cider, which was basically like an alcoholic form of apple juice that apparently lots of poor Americans really liked. And on the other hand, they labeled Van Buren as a rich snob, which he actually was. The funny thing, though, is that William Henry Harrison was also super rich. He was born, he lived in a giant plantation house in Virginia. And so neither of these guys were actually poor men of the people. But William Henry Harrison was better at appearing to be so. And there was very little discussion of the actual issues, like how to make America better or like what government should do, and more talking about who was more like the common man. Harrison wins this argument, and he wins big time, and he becomes president and Martin Van Buren loses. And this shows us that popular politics is here to stay. And from now on, if you want to be president, you have to be able to talk to poor, normal, uneducated Americans. That is the end of this video. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you tomorrow.